Hello, brilliant and embodied souls. My name is Kim. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. I have a new series that I've been considering for some time, and that is this idea of colliding shelves. I have the shelves that house my books, and I have the shelves that house my decks. And I love the idea of them inspiring each other. What I'm reading can be reflected in the cards that I'm using, and the cards that I'm using can be reflected in what it is that I'm reading. So that is the premise of this series. So I plan to take a look at a particular book that I'm really enjoying and share with you some of the decks that are complementing my work with that particular material, the particular themes of that book. So to kick us off, I have been loving this book, Psychopomps and the Soul. This is by Tiffany Lazic. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And this is a book that is just right up my alley. It is written by a spiritually oriented psychotherapist. And you know, so that describes me in so many ways. Tiffany is a very beautiful writer. I'm aware of some of the other books that she has out there. I don't own any of those books and haven't read any of these books. This is my first, and it's just proving to be very heartfelt and a very beautiful read. On the one hand, we have information presented about the different psychopomps that are found in various cultures around the world and who have shown up at different points in human history. The ancient psychopomps, and then maybe some more recent and modern ones, including us. We can be psychopomps. And in many ways, I identify as a human psychopomp. Therapists, death doulas, birth doulas, ministers, priestesses, people who are holding up a torch to show the way for others through times of change and struggle and transition qualify as psychopomps. I'm very drawn personally to people who hold these types of roles. There's just a depth to people who are guides for others, because in order to guide others, we have to be on a path ourselves. And I have immense respect for people who step onto paths of that ilk and of that nature. Tiffany really talks about how to step onto that path in this book. As I mentioned earlier, there's research that has been done around different cultures, books of the dead, the psychopomps themselves. She categorizes those psychopomps. And then she also begins to talk about her personal work in being a psychopomp, not only as a therapist, but also in terms of her own grief and loss with regards to several of her family members. So this book is very unique. It is researched. There's information being presented, as I've said, and it's also a type of memoir. There's a intimacy within this book because of Tiffany's vulnerability in sharing what it meant to lose her son and what it meant to lose her brother. I am only halfway through reading this particular book, so if I've gotten any of those details wrong, please excuse me. But that is some of the gist here. There's just so much beauty and a lot of practical guidance here as well. How can we step into some of those roles that I mentioned? And we don't have to do it professionally, right? We don't have to dedicate our lives to it, but sometimes life calls us to be temporary psychopomps or situational psychopomps, which is something I also really, really love about this book. It is recognizing that at some point in time, we're all going to be guides. We're all going to have to sit in the discomfort of the crossroads, whether it's with ourselves or with others. Yeah, so I'm really, really digging this book. It has been colliding with my tarot shelf, and there are several decks, tarot and oracle, that have really matched and mirrored the energies found in Psychopomps and the Soul. So I want to share some of the decks that have been really calling to me as of late because I am reading this book. You've already picked up on the themes of what this book has to offer. So I will try to weave back in the various themes and why these particular decks are really awesome for the major themes found within this text. I think the deck that is calling to me the most around this particular book is the Death Duela Oracle. And I can't say enough about this deck. Others have spoken about it as well, so maybe nothing new here. We've got very abstract and liminal photography that mirrors what it feels like to be in the Bardo. We're moving from one thing to the next, which is a very large part of, what Psychopomps embody, whether they're human or otherwise. There's a solemn nature to this deck or feel to this deck. It's very sobering. There's also a messiness, a chaos to this deck, which reflects how grief can feel in our bodies and in our psyches. When we're trying to make big changes, it can feel very chaotic. We can feel all over the place. The artwork in this deck reflects that feeling in a visceral way. This is not a pretty deck, although I actually find the art to be very beautiful, but beautiful because it's real, it's truthful, as opposed to superficial and aspirational. That's not what's going on in this deck. There's a rawness to this deck that I really, really appreciate. I've heard others speak about this deck in the context of grief, in the context of change and transition, for good reason. The other thing about this deck is the guidebook. there are some very strong practices referenced in the guidebook. So you get a you get a nice introductory setup to work with the deck. Then you get more divinatory meanings to the cards. Then they reference to the back section of the book where there are practices and rituals that will really help you deepen into that grief process, that transition process, right? The psychopomp, the reality of being a psychopomp or working with psychopomps. The rituals and practices in here are really, really good. And I say that as a somatic psychotherapist. You know, when I work with people who are experiencing grief and you know, there's often grief around some of the areas that I work in, around eating disorders and other forms of trauma. There's always grief that accompanies those types of experiences. So the practices in this little white book are fully endorsed by me. And then the very last section is this the little section on the big death. And I think that this can be very, very comforting to anybody who has lost somebody recently. There's a real reverence in this deck, and I think all of us need, you know, something like this in our lives. The production is just also so gorgeous. The card stock is just swoosh, delicious. The gold is so warm and inviting against the white, the simple white. There's a real honoring of light and darkness and the contrast of that within this particular deck. So it's just been a really wonderful deck for me in alongside this particular book. Let's move on to another oracle deck, and then we'll take a look at the two tarot decks that are really resonating with this particular book. The other oracle is the Stone and Shadow Oracle. This is a incredibly liminal oracle. There are a lot of gateways and thresholds within this deck. There's a lot of light and shadow play happening. There's a liminality. We have a lot of figures walking into or away from shadows and light. Where are they going? Where have they been? How did we get to this particular space and place within the card? There's a lot of homages to cathedrals and sacred places within this deck, cemeteries, graveyards. It's very much a deck of the underworld. It's very much a deck of the Bardo. Again, that play of light and shadow within the card, it tells a story, right? The beams of light, following the beams of light. Where are they taking you, the querent, within each of these cards? There's pathways, crossroads. And so many of the images, I sometimes wonder, where am I at in this card, because there's so many layers to each of the images. So it can feel a touch disorienting and surreal, which is a really visceral feeling as related to the themes of Psychopomp and Soul. Because again, like when we're dealing with grief, when we're dealing with doubt and fear and uncertainty, because we're trying to get from A to B to C, but we don't know how to do that. This deck really meets me in that traverse, the movement that's required to make some of those transitions. This is a really, really beautiful deck. And it has more of that beauty and grace and hope than maybe the Death Duela. The Death Duela feels more raw, whereas this feels a little bit more like put together, a little bit more guide within the Psychopomps and Soul. This is a gorgeous deck, and you know, going back to this book, the author does categorize the various types of psychopomps. So I will talk about what those are. So we have the passage guides, the threshold keepers, the gatherers, the rescuers, the visitors, the comforters, and the harbingers. So I would say that the death doula can act as a harbinger. It can also act as a comforter, and definitely a passage guide. The Stone and Shadow Oracle, you know, that feels more like the comforter and the threshold keeper and the gatherers. So these are some distinctions that the author makes within the book that I can see playing out within the contrast between the Stone and Shadow Oracle and the Death Doula. The Death Doula does give a lot more concrete support because of the rituals and practices that are offered. The little white book for the Stone and Shadow is poetry. So this doesn't have that type of directive that you'll find in the Death Doula. So, you know, sometimes we need some very clear guidance and direction as to like, what do we do with our grief? The Death Doula is amazing for that. You know, other times we need to feel seen and supported in our grief. And I think the Stone and Shadow really shines in those aspects. Although they both shine in that way. Okay, let's move on to some of the tarot decks that feel really resonant with the Psychopomps and Soul. The first would be the Moonchild Tarot. So there is a hopefulness within the Psychopomps and Soul book. You know, it is not all about the struggles that we face when we're in times of transition or grief. There's a life-giving aspect to the text. There's an acknowledgement that, you know, change is necessary. That life, death, life cycle is a necessary cycle. The Moonchild Tarot embraces that cycle to me. And here's the Death card, just to demonstrate that, right? There can be an ecstasy and joy in endings, as much as the grief and the sorrow and despair. This deck feels grounded in some of those challenges, and then moving you out of those challenges and into the hope and the promise of what is to come. I picked this deck because there are a lot of thresholds in this deck as well. There's a lot of going from here to there within this deck. There's also a lot of liminality represented within the card images. Yeah. There's also this groundedness as well as cosmicness within this deck. Sometimes it feels like we're on Earth and living a magical existence here on Earth. Other times it feels like we're on a different planet or a different dimension or something, and how do we transition from the mundane to the magical back to the mundane. This deck does that kind of dance. At one point we're in the forest, like we just saw in the Five of Swords, and then a moment later we're in a ancient temple that has transported us to another dimension, like in this Eight of Pentacles. It's a really imaginative deck. My only critique really does come from the use of all young people within the deck. That Queen of Pentacles is a great example. Like, I really wish that there was more age diversity and body diversity within this particular deck. That is my number one critique. But it's just a really, really beautiful and soft and gentle deck. Because maybe we need some of that softness and that gentleness when we're moving with the themes that Psychopomps deal with. The final thing I'll say is that, there is a lot of Egyptian imagery found within this particular deck, like a lot of magical imagery. So, we have depictions of Thoth, who is a kind of a psychopomp. There's allusions and homages to many of the deities and spirits discussed in this particular book. So it feels very resonant for those reasons as well. Okay, the last deck that I'm really, really digging to go along with the Psychopomps and Soul is Remembering the Sweet Fool Tarot. So admittedly, I have not worked with this deck a ton because I really feel that this is calling to me in the darker half of the year. We're moving into that part of the year. But nevertheless, like this just feels very Psychopomp to me. There's a strangeness and bizarreness to the images, right? Okay, the lovers, we have these two bird figures. What are these birds made out of? What is this little twig? There's a strangeness and abstractness and like tilt your headness to this deck because of the artwork. I'm often in awe of the liminality of the artwork. It just feels so, what is this? What am I looking at? Which creates curiosity, which creates a type of confusion, but the best kind of confusion, because it's that chaos feeling of what is happening here. But it's generative. In this case, the chaos and uncertainty feels incredibly generative because it's put into the structure of the tarot. I can feel how this deck and I are going to have a real love affair as the light wanes where I live. And that approaches. But I think that this deck and the Psychopomps of Soul like really, really go together because of some of what I mentioned, right? We can feel very confused, but we can also feel very curious on the thresholds of change. After we've been with the grief, then real magic can happen. There's a renewed innocence. This deck has a lot of innocence within it. It feels almost childlike because of the little bird and trinkets that were used. But there's also a sophistication and adultness. Like, this feels like a psychopomp who has integrated their inner child. It feels like it was created by someone or resonates, with people who have built a relationship with their inner child in order to play and create and make very imaginative artwork, while also being keenly aware of the very adult themes of loss and transformation, and alchemical reconfiguring ourselves because of what has happened to us. This deck feels like someone who has those qualities. That those are the qualities of this deck. Like, the personality of this deck is very grown up, and wise and connected with the earth and connected with all the elements, honestly, while still being whimsical, playful, and curious. It is such a beautiful deck. And it really is calling to me as I deepen into this book. The book gets progressively more personal and intimate. And I feel that this deck is going to be a very personal and intimate deck for me. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of shelves colliding and how what we're reading can inspire the decks that we're using, and the decks that we're using inspire how we read a particular book. I look forward to hearing the books that you're reading and maybe the tarot decks that inspired it, or vice versa. Please leave me some comments down below. I love learning about how our shelves can influence one another. Or I love thinking about how our shelves can influence one another. Thanks so much for being here, and I will see you in the next video. So much love till then. Bye.